everybody. This is my WebTeach for English 103 on Gia Tolentino's chapters entitled Ecstasy and the Story of a Generation and 7 Scams from her book Trick Mirror that we are reading as essentially one of the culminating texts for our class. Again, I'm still waiting on my laptop, so this is being filmed on my iPhone, so it's not going to be as well produced, let's say, as previous productions, or maybe it'll be even better because I don't know, I'm horrible at technology. I'm going to make it as fast as I can without going too fast so that we can understand some of these concepts. As you can see, I have everything written on the board behind me. So I will close up the screen on the board in a moment. And I'm going to talk about what each of these mean in relation to this week's readings, not just the Tolentino readings, but also the chapter readings that we've been doing last week and this week on research. My point this week is really to have you thinking about research and what we can do, what writers do with research beyond just, going to a scholarly website or, heaven forbid, going to Google or Wikipedia and using those questionable sources, but when we do good research, what it looks like. So really think about that as you're studying these readings. There's so much other cool stuff in this readings that I hope we'll get to when we have our drop-in Zoom or our class discussion, depending on which class this is for. So many cool things. And, if you're reading this in a post-COVID-19 world and you're not just kicking the wall, hopefully not, if you're, I don't want you to have to pay your parents or your landlord or whoever you're living with. But this really is stuff that is so relevant to the world today and what we're seeing as the consequences of what Tolentino talks about. So I hope you enjoy it. I know it's a little on the challenging side, but it's also full of cool current events and pop culture facts and all that. So I hope you like it. So we're going to talk about the two readings. Get this straight there. The first one is Ecstasy, right? So everything on Ecstasy I've put in purple there. So I'll try my best to, I'm having to do this on my phone, which is very difficult. But I want you to read those questions you see there. The first one is, Tolentino is making this connection between religion and drug use and also identity, right? If we think back to her discussion in an earlier chapter about how identity is not just the self, but sort of the self's relationship with the community. And if we think back to writers like Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, we get that same message, right? Identity is not just about the individual experience, but about a community experience. So what is Tolentino saying about identity in relation to drugs and to religion and all of those things? So I'm trying my best to keep it on these questions. It's really hard with a phone. The next question related to the chapter entitled Ecstasy is, again, think about her research, how she shares it and what she does with it. She's doing research on interesting things, everything from, a Houston area 90s rapper to televangelists, to major drug research. So she's bringing in a variety of sources, different kinds of sources. If you think about the crap test, right, different source material, but all credible for what she's talking about. So think about those things. And then the last question I have is more of expanding beyond what she talks about and just kind of riffing on your own. What's the connection, do you think, between empathy? Because she talks a lot about the drug ecstasy, which is now known as MDMA or Molly, and how it was originally supposed to be called empathy, right? And there's this need from, religion or drugs or whatever else for empathy. And my question to you is, what is that connection between empathy and critical thought? In other words, why do we crave things like religion or drugs if ultimately what we're looking for is empathy? How might that relate to critical thought? in the sense of our own personal identity and how we experience the world. So those are some questions to think about for that chapter. And then why am I horrible at this? All right, and then the next chapter is the story of a generation and 7 scams. This is a little bit longer of a chapter, but it's really cool because she talks about all these really cool scams. Some that you've probably seen in the recent media, right? Like the whole girl boss thing, or the fire festival, or the student debt crisis, which is very relevant to your experience, and other ones as well, right? The election and all that stuff. So what am I doing? This is all counterintuitive to me. All right, so break up the reading into those doable subheadings. That's what I would say to do. If you're looking at it and you're like, oh, this is so long, read a subheading at a time. It's going to be a lot easier to do it that way. And then think about the subheadings as if this is like an essay. If each one is roughly equivalent to like the claim of an essay, right? The one central idea to each body paragraph. Clearly, these subheadings are longer than a body paragraph, but if we can kind of see this as a rough parallel to an essay, if each subheading is equivalent to a claim, look at all those 7 claims she's making. What's the overall argument she has to say? There is some difficult vocabulary, so make sure as you're reading and annotating that you're putting a box around difficult vocabulary, defining it, and then rereading it in context. And then just your thoughts, do you think these people are scammers? Do you agree with this argument she has about the millennial generation and scamming, or even Generation Z that we're coming into and scamming? What are your thoughts? How are you reacting to this piece? All right. And then finally, sorry, I'm getting tired of holding the phone. Finally, I want you to think about the similarities between these readings. One thing you'll notice, with any writer, especially a very effective and well-known writer, they're going to have sort of structural go-tos. A great example that I always like to use is Steinbeck. If you read anything by John Steinbeck, odds are that the chapter or the reading is going to begin with a very detailed account of the setting. That's just Steinbeck's thing that he does, right? Tolentino has her own approach where she structures her writing very deliberately and very specifically. So think about how she structures each chapter, particularly these 2 chapters we're looking at, what she does as a writer to draw the reader in, to really get the reader to start thinking about sometimes challenging contemporary concepts. And then think about research. Again, research is a big thing that I want us to look at this week. So think about a couple things, and let me pan out here. So the first thing I want you to think about is the crap test PowerPoint that you see on Canvas and the rubric. Okay, the rubric is for you to use when you are doing research, but it's essentially what any good researcher asks herself when she's doing research, right? Which is this relevant? Is it credible? Is it up to date? All these sorts of questions. So that's going to be a really helpful rubric for you to use to make sure that you're using the best quality of sources. Again, the analogy I like to use is like, if we talk about, let's say, climate change, and we have all these great things to say about climate change, but then you tell me that, your unemployed Coors Light drinking Uncle Jedediah from down the street who's, living with his mom and, punched out a little kid or something. If you tell me he told you that information, I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical, even if I believe it to be true, even if I agree with what he has to say. It's going to make me question it if it's coming from a seemingly unreliable source than if it's coming from, say, a climate scientist, a researcher, someone who's devoted her life to this sort of stuff, right? The same can be said for Google and Wikipedia and infotainment news sites, right? A lot of those sources that you get off of Google where the topic is the title, right? Like your well-being in the millennium or, stuff like that. You want to stay away from those because, one, a lot of those people are just getting paid to spout whatever the publication wants them to spout, right? It's ad revenue. but also because you can't test the reliability of those sources. Sometimes reliable writers have stuff published on Google. I'm not saying that's not the case, but it's a haystack that is very difficult to find a needle of quality when you have much better resources like the library website. So in terms of the crap test, and again, the chapter notes of chapters 18 and 19 on research, types of sources, uses of sources, and evaluation, really review that. Really review those chapters and those PowerPoints to make sure that you can not only evaluate the research that Tolentino does, but that you can prepare yourself for quality research, looking at these contemporary issues of interest, right? Because, and this is so important, as you see here, this is, you're blah, 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 blah. You're essentially going to choose a topic from Tolentino that we've been studying and previous, because a lot of the readings that, anticipate Tolentino up to this point can be woven in, things like Robert Putnam or things like Molly Young's article on Amanda Chantel Bacon, right? Even Alexander Wu, right? We're seeing those similarities with the previous class readings. And if you look at Essay 4, it kind of breaks it down into different topics you might want to consider researching. Because Essays 4 and 5 are working toward the same goal. And you may go, what the heck? Why are you having us write 2 essays on the same thing? Well, because as you go on in college, you'll realize that that's not uncommon. If you decide on going to grad school, or even if you do professional work, what you'll find a lot of times is that you are researching the same topic in greater and greater and greater depth. So Essay 4 is essentially going to serve as like a rough annotated bibliography of the research that you're doing for your final essay. So think of it in those terms. That's why it's so close to the essay submission date. We'll talk about that more in WebTeaches and in class Zoom meetings and in notes to come. But really think about Essay 4 as the precursor to Essay 5, as you showing the work that you're doing, the gathering of research, the implementation of what you're doing with that research, the thought process, the critical nature to your writing, all of that, right? You're showing me that in Essay 4. It's like you're showing me the process. And then Essay 5 is that final product, that end result. Yes, there's going to be a little bit of redundancy, but it's good. Redundancy is not a bad thing, especially in the writing process. You keep the good, you repeat the good while you're writing. Well, not in the writing, but while you're writing. And then you throw out the bad, right? So what you start to see in holding on to the good stuff and revisiting it and refining it is you start to see how beautiful your writing can be. Because again, all first drafts are crummy. And if that's all we've been used to doing is constructing first drafts, that's why we think we're crummy writers. No good writer out there publishes their first draft. It doesn't happen. So I want you to, again, start thinking about this in terms of a research process and a writing process. And one thing that is really cool about this book, it's kind of like a cheat sheet, but it's also Tolentino showing that she cares about research and that she cares about worthwhile information versus just, I got this off of Google type of information. And what that is in the back of the book, in the back of this book here, Trick Mirror, she has this great section that's cut up chapter by chapter and shows all the research that she did for each one of those chapter essays, each one of those essentially kind of like articles that she probably published before this, made it into this book. So, we have the various chapters. If you look at, I'm just going to kind of opening the book here. If you look at the table of contents, it just says contents, right? You see all the chapters and the page numbers, where to find them. That's great. But then if you go to the back of the book, after you've read those chapters and you've seen some of those cool sources and you're like, this is a killer idea. This is totally up my alley, or it has something to do with my major, or I just want to know more about it, or I'm going to write essay 4 and 5 about it. Here is what she does, which is so cool. She gives you a bibliography of the chapter. Not an annotated bibliography, but she gives you a bibliography, a works cited, if you will, of all the sources that she uses and that she mentions in that chapter, okay? And what you'll notice for one of your discussion boards is you are required to find out more about any one of those sources in the chapter Ecstasy. That's kind of why I showed it to you. You're required to find out more about one of those topics, one of those sources that she mentions, because that's what research is. It's finding out about something that interests you, or that you think is cool, or maybe that you hate, or just something you want to know more about because you don't know a lot about it. And then you look in those bibliographies that the other writers that you're reading have presented to you, and you go down a rabbit hole. You know, you find one reading, you enter that information into the library website, it pops up. Then that leads you to another works cited with more readings that you can research. You know, it's a never-ending sort of way of researching. So I want you to get in that habit, because it's an incredibly helpful habit to find good research, right? When you start with just one good source that has good research, and you go to its bibliography or its works cited page, and then you go to those great sources, bibliographies or works cited pages, you know, you end up building this body of research that is incredibly impressive and helpful to whatever argument you're constructing. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind when you're doing your own research. And always double check it and make sure that it passed the crap test regardless. Or that at least if it's one sort of contemporary pop culture source, like maybe a rap song or something, that you are combining it and padding it and buffering it with quality sources like scholarly sources or research or data and statistics or things like that. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you watch this video and bring questions to our class discussion and bring ideas to your discussion boards. And I hope you have a wonderful night. So I will see you later. Good luck. Bye.